The environment has made many worldwide headlines. Joining me now to discuss the issue is Dr. Calvin Beisner, national spokesperson for the Cornwall Alliance, a group made up of natural scientists, economists, and theologians. Dr. Beisner, welcome to the show. We are so happy to have you on today.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be on the program with you.
All right, and I should have mentioned to you, you're joining us from Memphis, Tennessee, correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Now, since this is right up your alley, why don't you tell us, in your opinion, what makes a true environmentalist?
Well, I think a true environmentalist is simply somebody who thinks, I want to make my life the kind of life that leaves the earth a better place than when I entered it. We put it this way, that as Christians involved in this, we take very seriously the instruction from God to human beings in Genesis 1:28 that we are supposed to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it, or rule it. But we don't want that ruling, that dominion, to be abusive, to be exploitative. Rather, we want it to reflect the way that God rules his creation. And what we see in the earlier verses of Genesis 1 is that God makes everything out of nothing. He brings light out of darkness, order out of chaos, life out of non-life, great variety of life. He instructs all the different forms of life to be fruitful and highly fecund. This is the kind of thing that we should be doing ourselves. So we describe this godly sort of dominion as men and women created in God's image, working together to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors.
Now, you have written a book called Creation A Stewardship, evaluating competing views, in which you mention in that book that it's dangerous to put people or celebrities on a pedestal, such as someone like Greta Thunberg. So why do you say that?
Well, frankly, we need to actually know a lot about what it is we talk about when we pretend to give other people advice. And too often, celebrities, whether it be someone as young as Greta Thunberg, who began speaking out on these things at age 16, or Hollywood celebrities, many of them really, frankly, have never learned in great depth about these issues. I've been studying these issues since the mid-1980s, so it's 35 years in this, and even so, there are parts of this where I would not seek to speak out as an expert. I realize the limits of my own knowledge. So what we need to do is to go to people who really have true expertise on these things. That's why I put together the Cornwall Alliance the way we did. We have just under 70 scholars in our network. About a third are natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists. About a third are economists and policy wonks, and about a third are theologians and philosophers. So we try to bring all of those different insights together to address highly complex problems. And if we don't bring the different disciplinary backgrounds together, we're likely to have rather narrow, superficial approaches to solving very difficult problems.
Mm-hmm. Now, you wrote an interesting piece on your blog with the headline, Global Average Temperature Plummets, Tropical Temperature Fall, third biggest on record. Were you trying to make a point there?
The point is not that that proves that global warming isn't real. No, it doesn't prove any such thing. The point instead is that what we get in the climate debates is that the advocates of the notion of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, man-made global warming that is catastrophic, will point to every heat wave, every temporary uptick in temperature as evidence that global warming is not only real, but is potentially catastrophic, that it is overwhelmingly man-made, things of that sort. But they won't do the same with downticks in temperature. And so I'm just simply pointing out an inconsistency. If that brief downturn in global average temperature about 2 years ago was not evidence against, then a brief upturn is not evidence for. What we need to be doing is looking at very long-term data and looking for real trends rather than anomalies in the trends. And the long-term data do show us that, well, the Earth's average surface atmospheric temperature has risen by roughly a degree Celsius since about the middle of the 19th century. And I think that human emissions of carbon dioxide have contributed to that. But the notion that it's catastrophic, the notion that it is overwhelmingly human, man-made, those notions, I think, are not well established in the actual evidence.
Okay, so we need to be careful not to fall into misleading information, basically, is what you're saying, whether it comes to social media or headlines. So how can the average viewer know what headline to trust?
Well, the self-serving answer for me would be to say, come to cornwallalliance.org, cornwallalliance.org. But, really, the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. So this is why when we post things on the Cornwall Alliance's website, we make sure that we have links to sources of outstanding scholarly work so that people are able to check the figures for themselves, check the data. That's part of what we're supposed to do as Christians. And that's really the heart of what it is to be scientific. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman said that the key to science is that when we have a hypothesis, a guess as to how something works in nature, we set up experiments to see whether what would happen if our guess were right really does happen. And if the observations that come from the experiment, whether in the laboratory or out in the real world, if the observations contradict the prediction, then our guess, our hypothesis, even our theory is wrong. And it doesn't matter how smart we are or how beautiful our guess was or anything else. If observation contradicts theory, then the theory is wrong. And we have to go back to the drawing board. And that's what we get essentially in terms of the claims of very rapid, potentially catastrophic global warming. Those claims are all based not on empirical observations, but on computer models of how the atmosphere responds to added CO2. And the models, on average, predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually observed over the relevant period. That means the models are wrong, and they really need correcting.
Well, so you mentioned CO2, and we were talking about headlines. So headlines tell us that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels is the main cause of global warming. But you disagree with this claim, right?
Well, I think it's actually theoretically possible that that's true. What I think is that the best empirical evidence indicates that it's probably not true. Notice I said probably. I think in many, many different scientific things, we're quite mistaken to speak with total confidence and assurance. I would be wrong to say, well, it's a settled matter that CO2 from fossil fuels is not the primary cause of warming. I also think it's wrong to say, well, the science is settled. CO2 is the primary cause from burning fossil fuels. Here's why I say what I do. It's precisely because the computer models of global climate predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually has been observed in response to the added CO2 in the atmosphere, that we know, therefore, that the models are wrong, that they are over-predicting the amount of influence that CO2 has on global average temperature. When we look back through the history of global temperatures, we see that there have been very similar periods of warming in the past, such as the Minoan warm period, the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period. We've also seen cooling periods in the past, and the interesting thing is that although there is a correlation between temperature and CO2 content in the atmosphere, the correlation is the opposite of what you would think it would be if CO2 were the control knob for temperature. That is, temperature changes first, CO2 changes later. And the reason for that is that as the ocean warms, it outgasses CO2. Ocean water contains CO2. The warmer it is, the less CO2 it keeps in mixture. The colder it is, the more CO2 it holds. So as the temperature changes first, the CO2 follows.
Wow, you are very much a scientist, I could tell. Now, I don't know how it is in the US. I know that our federal government here, and you're probably aware of this, but our federal government here is requiring that all provinces put a carbon tax into place. Do you think that this will produce any positive results?
No, I think it will not produce positive results. And the fundamental reason is this, that a carbon tax assumes that adding carbon dioxide, and by the way, it's very deceptive to speak of it as a carbon tax because carbon is an element, and in its solid form, it's a black nasty dust, and it can be a problem. Okay, carbon dioxide is not carbon; it is carbon plus two atoms of oxygen. It's an odorless, colorless gas that is non-toxic at concentrations 20 times what they are in our present atmosphere. And it is absolutely essential to life. Plants need it for photosynthesis. And the more of it there is, the better plants grow. So treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant is actually, I think, quite the opposite of what it really is. The more CO2 there is in the air, the better plants grow, and that means there's more food for everything that eats plants or eats something else that does eat plants. So the result is a huge increase in crop yields around the world. This has been studied in literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies showing that we have seen an increase in crop yields measured in terms of about $3.2 trillion of extra food from 1960 to 2012, and we can expect about another $9.8 trillion worth of food just because we've added CO2 to the atmosphere from 2012 to 2050. So you don't tax something that you want more of. You reward it instead. So no, a carbon tax would not be a good idea.
Oh, wow. Now, Dr. Beisner, you believe that the current global response to climate change actually could have some implications, especially for the poor, right?
I do. And that's simply because everything that we produce, we do it using energy. It takes energy to grow food, to process food, to transport food, to make clothing, to make shelter, to have communication. We're using energy right now in this Skype call. It takes vast amounts of energy to lift and keep whole societies out of poverty. Now, the less expensive energy is, the more of it people can use. And in fact, historically, it has been access to abundant, affordable energy, primarily through fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas, that has lifted and kept whole societies out of poverty. If we're going to fight allegedly catastrophic, allegedly overwhelmingly man-made global warming by pushing fossil fuels out of our energy mix, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to raise the cost of energy because the fossil fuels are the cheapest source aside from nuclear and hydro. They're much cheaper than wind and solar when you count everything into the price. But two, we're also going to make that energy less reliable. The wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining. And because of that, you don't have a steady input of energy into the electric grid. That means you have an unstable grid. The more unstable it is, the more you're going to have brownouts and blackouts, and those things kill.
Now, a lot of Western nations are phasing out coal. How much of a problem is coal to the environment?
Well, if you burn coal in a really sloppy way, coal burning can be a very big problem to the environment. But in all developed countries, we have adopted ways of burning coal to generate electricity that are extremely clean. And essentially, the only thing that comes out of the misnamed smokestacks of coal-fired generating plants in developed countries is water vapor. It's just simply steam from the turbines and the cooling towers. Nothing else comes out. So coal can be badly used, and sometimes it is in very poor countries. And yet the interesting thing that happens, and we see this through the history of our environments and of our economies as well, is that even while air pollution rises in the early stages of economic development, as countries begin to use coal and can't yet afford the very, very highly efficient ways of using it, even while the air pollution rises, life expectancy rises too. And what that means is that the benefits of all of the economic development, driven in part by the use of coal, outweigh the risks. And then as people get wealthy enough, they can afford to adopt the cleaner technologies of using coal, and then you get rid of the pollution, and at the same time you have the benefits of that economic development.
Dr. Beisner, we're out of time, but thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you very much, and your listeners can learn more at cornwallalliance.org.